The first butterfly that we'll create together is themed around the element of earth. The energy of the earth is one of abundance, a solid foundation, and a grounding force. The colors are green, brown, and black. So let's get started using these colors and elements found from nature to create our beautiful earth element butterfly. For the base of my project, I'm using a wood slice that I got at the local craft store, but please feel free to really get imaginative for your base. Not much of it will show in the end product, so you really could even use a piece of cardboard and paint it. You could also use elements from nature, so a nice branch or a tiny log or really anything that you can find on a nature walk that could potentially work for this project. So like I said before, not much of this base will actually show through on the finished project, but I am taking some time to paint mine a little darker color with just some inexpensive craft paints. So depending on what base you use, you can decide whether you need to paint yours or not. I am using my earth colors, so browns and greens, and once I have it fully painted, I will give it time to dry. Now it's time to draw our butterfly. You'll need watercolor paper, a piece of tracing paper, and a pencil. I'm using my base as a guideline for the size and shape of my butterfly. I'm putting grid line marks at the top, bottom, right, and left of my base so that when I remove the base, I have a nice guideline to draw my butterfly. I'll start by drawing the base or the body of the butterfly. So I use my pinky as kind of a guideline as how big the body should be. And once I have that body shape in, then I will begin to draw one side of the wings. It's helpful to look at pictures of butterfly for inspiration. So for the shape of mine, I actually am going loosely by a buckeye butterfly. So if you'd like to look that up for inspiration, that is the basic shape that I'm trying to create. And for this process, we're only going to draw one set. So I'm drawing both of the leaves, or both of the wings on the left-hand side. And then we'll use tracing paper to trace our design, flip it, and then create it on the right-hand side. Once you have one set of wings looking how you want them to look, then it's time to use your tracing paper and trace your design. Once you've got your design traced, you simply turn the paper over, place it where it should go, and then retrace on the back side. Your graphite from your pencil that's on the front side where you originally traced is now going to transfer from the tracing that you're doing now, from the pressure that your pencil's making, it will transfer onto the watercolor paper. It's way easier to do than it is to explain. You don't need to press any harder when you're retracing this, so just normal pressure, just as if you were tracing it just like you did the first time. If you push down too hard, you'll create indentions on your watercolor paper, so just be careful with that. Once you're finished tracing, you can remove your trace paper and you should have a pretty symmetrical butterfly left over. You may need to darken some of the lines that you trace. Sometimes they don't transfer quite as well. But other than that, you should be all set. So before we actually paint our butterfly, I thought we would go over a few things about watercolor, just to give you some tips and techniques before we actually paint the butterfly. So with watercolor, I typically work wet into wet, which means that you'll have a wet surface and you'll have wet paint. And one of the ways I like to explore color and different techniques is by making these little circles. I call them my little watercolor planets. And it really is a lot of fun. You really take the pressure off yourself because you're just making a circle, so no pressure in that. And you can really explore and just feel free to kind of cut loose with techniques and try different things and see what happens. So the colors that I'm going to be using are Green Apatite, which is by Daniel Smith. And the reason that I chose this color is because we're working with the element of earth, and apatite is actually a crystal, a stone that comes from the earth, so I thought that might be kind of fun. And then I'm also going to be using a brown. This one is Burnt Umber. This one's by Winsor Newton, but Burnt Umber is pretty standard across all brands. And I'm also going to be using Quinacridone Gold. So whatever greens, browns, golds, feel free to really explore with what the colors that you have. So the first thing that I'm going to do with my little circle here is wet the entire circle. So I'm using just clean water and a brush, and the amount of water that you want to put in, you can really experiment with this. So do a couple of circles, one fill with puddles of water, and then you can see the difference between the amount of water that you put on your paper as to how the paint will react within the water. So there's so many variables that you can really do with just water alone in watercolor. So this one, I've got the surface pretty shiny. I'm going to take out like the excess water. So on mine, I don't really have any puddles. I have a shiny surface, but if I were to pick my paper up and move it around, nothing would drip out of that circle. So no overloads of water here. So I've got a wet surface. I also want to make sure that I have wet paint. So the way that I work my watercolor, I use tubes mostly. I put out a pea-sized amount of watercolor, and when I add my water, I pull from the side here and make myself a watery puddle of the mixture. And as I use this puddle, I'll add water, pull from the side, and reconstitute my little puddle there. So you can experiment here too with how much paint you add to your puddle. So you can see once it hits the water, this paint in particular kind of moves and flows into the water. Some paints will really take over, some paints won't move quite as much. So like I said, a really good way to get to know your paint. And so here I'm going to grab some more paint from my little puddle here, or into my little puddle. So now I've got a more saturated mixture, and you can see how much darker that gets. So this really gives you an idea of what you want your end result to be. It allows you to just kind of play with the ideas before you actually get into creating your butterfly. So you can see I'm just plopping in paint, letting it flow. I'm going to pretty much fill my entire circle with the green. Green is going to be my dominant color for my butterfly. So I'm going to do a lot of green here and just add in a little brown and a little gold. So once I get that in, also you can experiment with different brush sizes. So this is like middle of the road size. This is a 6. I'm now dropping down to a 2. So obviously the brushes will not hold as much pigment, as much water. So you can get a lot of different effects just by changing your brush size. So now I'm going into my brown. Once again, I need wet paint. If your paint is too dry, it won't go into the water. It'll just kind of sit on your brush. So kind of experiment with that and you'll see what I'm talking about. And I'm just going to start dropping in color, letting them mix and mingle and play with each other on my paper. And now I'll add in some gold. And this earthy green apatite pigment, it separates as well. It's a natural pigment, and so there's all these different properties inside that paint that will start to separate within water. So it really gives it kind of an earthy look. And feel free also, don't feel like you have to cover every area. So here I'm leaving some of the white paper to shine through and really just getting ideas for how I want my butterfly to look. So we're going to use salt of the earth. So you can also experiment with different types of salt. This is just plain old table salt. So it's pretty small, the granules are pretty small. And you sprinkle this in while the surface is still wet. And what will happen is the salt will start to suck in water, and it'll leave behind these little blooms or little granules. And it really depends on how much water is on your paper, the size of your salt, and the properties of the paint that you're using. So you can see why I make so many of these circles and do so many experiments, because there's so many variables. So feel free to experiment with salt, different sizes. If you use more of a rocky salt, a little bit bigger granules, you'll get completely different results. So I'm going to let this dry, and then I'll show you the next technique that we're going to use for our butterfly. Okay, so my circle has now dried, and once it's dry you can just rub the salt right off, and as you can see you can't really tell much from where I added my salt. And like I said before, that will all depend on the paint you're using and the amount of water, so you may get a completely different result than what I have here. So the technique that we're going to do next is layering, and I thought that would be kind of cool because of the earth, so many layers. So we're going to layer our paints as well. So you want to make sure that the surface is completely dry and that you have removed the salt. And I'm going to actually use my smaller brush for this, so I'm using a size 2. And for this technique we'll be keeping the paper dry and using wet paint. I'm going to be using a black. This is Ivory Black. This is by Cotman, but any dark color that you have, you don't even have to use black. I'm actually going to mix some of my black in with my brown, but a darker color so that you can cover what you already have. And with all the design work that we have on our butterfly, this is what how we're going to go about it. So we'll paint a layer of this first mixture of the green and browns, and then we'll come back over and create these designs with our darker color. So to do this, all you need is some wet paint, and you want to go kind of light. So you don't want the paint to be too intense. You can see here that I've got a fair amount of water in it, so it's not too dark. Remember, with watercolor you can always go darker. It's harder to lighten it up. So I've got wet paint on my brush, and I'm just going to begin to lay it down onto my dry layer here.
And for this, I'm just really making up some designs. On our butterfly, of course, we already have the designs penciled in. So it's kind of cool when you start doing these layers like this one here. You can see how I left some areas. I'm painting around these circle areas, and it ends up looking really neat when it dries. You've got all these colors and variations showing through that second layer of paint. And you can see I'm using quite a lot of water here because, like I said, I don't want it to be too dark. Definitely more intense than my first layer, but I don't want to completely hide that underlayer there. So watery paint for sure. So while the black is still wet, I can come back in with some wet brown paint. And I'm going to put some on my brush, and I'm just going to drop that right into that black and let those two colors mix and mingle right on my page. And it gives this, adding this brown into this black gives it a really warm tone, which is good for our earth tones here. So there you go. That is our second technique where we're going to layer another layer of paint right on top of our first. So let's get started with our butterfly.
We'll paint each wing separately, one by one, letting each one dry before we move to the next one. So I'm going to work just like I did in my circle. I'll wet the entire area of the wing that I'm working on and then apply my wet paint. I am applying water to the entire surface of the wing except for those round details that I have on each wing. So I'm going to paint those separately. It's not an absolute necessary step, but I just like the way it looks to be painted separately. And final step, don't forget to add your salt. Before you start painting the adjacent wing, you'll want to make sure that the first one is dry. Anytime wet meets wet, it'll run together, and we want to keep these separate. I'm using the exact same techniques. I'm wetting the entire area except for that small eye design, and then I'll start adding my wet paint. Once the first layers have dried, now we can start on our second technique of layering wet paint onto a dry layer. I'm using my blacks and browns just like I did in my circle. If you've kept your first layer kind of watery and light as I did on mine, you should still be able to see your pencil lines. But if you need to, you can use your original trace and go back over those lines if you need to, just to make sure you can see them while you're painting. For this next set of lines, I'm painting in my lines with my wet paint. Then I'll dip my paintbrush into the water and pull that color to the left with the water that's on my brush. It kind of fades the color out gently. It's a nice technique to use on butterfly wings. And I'll also use more brown than black here, just for variation. I kind of switch in between the brown and the black. Gives a lot of visual interest to your wings. Now I'm going to paint the circle. I'm using wet paint on dry paper. I'm going to use a mixture of my black and browns, just like I've done for all the designs. And right now I'm just painting an outer circle for that. I'll let that dry and then come back and paint the inner circle. While the outer circle was drying, I went ahead and added the design work to my bottom wing, and now I'm painting the inner circles now that everything else has dried. I am using a mixture of gold and green. Once everything on the left side is finished, I repeat the same process on the right-hand side. All that's left is to paint this butterfly's body. I'm using wet brown paint on dry paper, and I'm going to fill in the entire body shape with brown. Then I'll add drops of black and gold. Once your butterfly is completely finished and completely dry, use scissors to cut the shape out.
Once you have your butterfly all painted and cut out, then you're going to flip it over, and we're going to paint the back side. For the back, I'm not going into much detail. I'm just going to do that first layer of that watery mixture of the greens and the browns and the golds. You can put more veining on if you'd like. The bottom of the wings we're not going to see much in the end product, so I'm just going to add some color to mine. And the only thing you have to be careful of is that when you come to these edges, you don't want to have too much water go over the side, because it will run under and disrupt what you've already got on the front side here. So just be careful. You could even put, just have a paper towel handy so you can kind of blot the edges of the side here so you don't make a mess of your front. So once you have the side completely painted, just leave it to dry and we'll start working on the other part of our project. Once your butterfly is all cut out and dry, and you've got both of your sides done, the cool thing about doing this on watercolor paper that's 140 pound or thicker is that because you've got this thick paper, you can kind of mold the wings. So what I like to do is I just put my finger here and just slightly bend the wing shape from here. So you get this crease, and you can decide, you know, how far up you want your wings to go, or they can lay more flat either way. So once everything is dry, you can fold your wings, and an optional step at this point is to seal your watercolor. It's not absolutely necessary, but it is nice to have just that kind of safe net of sealing the watercolor to the paper. So the way that you can do that is with a acrylic sealer, and the one that I am using is by Mod Podge. It's the matte. I've also tried gloss, which works really well if you want a little sheen and shine to it. And the process is pretty easy. You can really just read the directions on the can, but you give this can a good shake. Take it outside for sure because the smell is pretty horrendous. And you just lay your butterfly out somewhere where you can spray. And I give it one coat, let it dry for, you know, an hour or two, and then another coat. And I do both sides. So it dries to the touch really quick, so you can spray it, just wait a couple of minutes, and then turn it over, you know, you can handle it. And then I wait for that to dry really well, a couple of hours, and give it a second coat. And once you do that, you've got a really nice sealed finished product. So good thing to do, but absolutely not necessary if you don't want to go to the trouble. Okay, so let's move on to the next step. Okay, so as you can see, this is a bit of a messy process. I've grabbed some things from nature. I live in Florida, so a lot of these elements are actually from palm trees. This is like a fiber that comes off of the trunk of a palm tree that's in my yard. These are part of the fronds that hang down that had dried out. And twigs and things that I picked up from my yard. I've got some pebbles. And then these are actually I found in the floral department at my local craft store. So I really love these mossy materials. So as you can see, I'm gathering things that are of the earth for our earth totem. And what we're going to do is create kind of a collage with our earth elements onto this base. If you didn't use the wood, you really don't have to have a piece of wood. You really could use a piece of cardboard even and paint it, and your end result will really be the same. So I'm going to think about my composition, how I want this all to turn out, and I'll just use tacky glue is what I'm using. I'm sure any sort of craft glue that's meant for wood would work fine, so whatever you have will work. And just think about how you want your end result to be. Just kind of play around with placement. I'm thinking that I'm going to use a couple of twigs and that my butterfly is actually going to sit on this twig. So we'll see how that works out. Okay, so I got my collage of my earth materials pretty much worked out the way I liked it. I've glued everything down, and as you can see, it's dried. I let mine dry overnight, so everything is good on there. Nothing's like falling off, so I did a good job with the gluing. And while you're making your composition, you kind of want to think about where your butterfly is going to live. So I'm thinking that mine is going to live somewhere about right there. So just keep that in mind as you're designing your collage. Just kind of play around with where you would like it to be. So once we have the earth collage all done, all glued in, we've got our butterfly all set. Now all we have to do is glue the butterfly onto the material here. And I am going to be using the same stuff once again. So just going to apply my tacky glue onto here, some on here, stick him on there, and let him dry as well. As a final little added touch, I had a brainstorm at the last moment to add some texture to the body of the butterfly, and to do that all I did was take some felt. You can really brainstorm about other materials that you could use for this as well, but I took a little felt that I happen to have that was brown, just took a little snip of it, and I roll it in my hands like this to kind of get a kind of a butterfly body shape, and then simply used my tacky glue to attach it right to the body, and it just adds a nice textile feature to the body of the butterfly. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I am just loving the way this came out, and I cannot wait to see what you create.